Welcome, folks, to The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Every week, diving deep into the truth of Catholic social teaching and restoring all things in Christ.
The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
I'm Dr. Bud Marr.
And we are coming to you live, these United States, me over here in Des Moines, where I'm the Director of Mission and Ministry at Mercy College and the Director of the Zeta Institute for Foundation, Ethics, and Leadership. You can find us at mchs.edu and zetainstitute.com. But out there in Pittsburgh, what are you doing up there?
I am directing the National Institute for Newman Studies. If I could give a brief plug, we unveiled our digital database this week, so if you want to take a look at some pretty sweet images of Newman's letters, it's on our website, which is newmanstudies.org.
Digital database.
Digital. I feel big time now.
That's right. As always, we come to you live, underwritten by Mercy College of Health Sciences. We're getting ready to start the fall semester. You can, like I said, check that out, mchs.edu. But the reason I bring up at the very beginning of us talking here is we want to thank sponsors like Mercy College, but also sponsors like everyone listening on the radio, because this is the middle of our Carathon. It's easy to donate to the Carathon. You can go to www.iowacatholicradio.com. But, of course, what we're really waiting for, if you don't mind, is to call 515-223-1150. That's 515-223-1150, and get your donations or pledges in. And we have a $500 matching gift from Patricia Anderson. So every time you put $1, that dollar gets matched. So if we can get a $500 in the hour from our listeners, that will be $500 matched by Patricia Anderson, and that will be $1,000 for the hour that we have before us. Right now, the totals for the church's pledging so far, and I know a lot of this usually picks up as the week goes along, but Sacred Heart's out in front of everyone with $4,500, St. Francis $42,000, St. Teresa, 26, and then everybody else on down. So we got it a really good start. We want to keep it rolling. Later today, we have St. Pius X and Sacred Heart that are both going to be coming in. So if you are a Sacred Heart or St. Pius X church member, you can go ahead and get started early by calling 515-223-1150. That's 515-223-1150. But I know that you're out in Pittsburgh, so you're not necessarily looking at all the wonderful things that we have posted up here in the studio to talk about that people's pledges go to. But what do you personally, every time you wake up in the morning and look in the mirror, what are you thankful for when someone pledges? Because I know you've told me, like, you can feel it in your heart when someone gives a pledge, even out at Pittsburgh. I know that's not true. I'm joking.
Yeah, I'm thankful for a couple of things. I mean, this week, this time of the year, my mind always goes back to good memories in the studio, like trying to convince donors to give by doing push-ups for each dollar.
That's right.
And so I'm like grunting in the background while you guys were doing Sirius Radio.
Yeah, the important thing about that is our doctors all told us to stop. So no one is going to get hurt in the filming of this. But
do you guys have one of those thermometers?
We do not.
I love the thermometer. The fundraising thermometer.
I don't. We didn't do I don't see a thermometer. Everybody's not looking me in the eye like they're ashamed that we don't have a thermometer this year. We're doing what? Yeah. Oh, they're working. They said. Sorry, guys. My bad. Working too hard for a thermometer.
Don't let us distract.
That's right. They're doing social media, which is more important than it's sort of like the modern thermometer. But so like I said, you can donate 515-223-1150, iowacatholicradio.com/donate. Or just to get everything rolling of the sort of things that your donations go to. We have Ut Fidem, Keep the Faith, Father John Ricardo, December 7th, 2019 at 7 p.m. Ut Fidem and Iowa Catholic Radio presents Extraordinary News, an evening with Father Ricardo, the Grand Ballroom at the Iowa Event Center. You can get your tickets. Go to iowacatholicradio.com/Father-Ricardo. You can learn more about women's conferences if you go to iowacatholicradio.com/women's conference. And then the men's stag is September 18th. To purchase a table, Tony, just talk to the big guy at tcalumet@kwky.com. But it all starts with your donations. These are the sort of things that we're able to do when you donate to us. 515-223-1150, 515-223-1150, matching donor dollars up to $500 thanks to Patricia Anderson. All you got to do is call and talk to us. You don't have to leave your name. We'll we'll say your name online if you'd like, on air, excuse me, or we can talk about it anonymously. But we thank all of our pledges. You can do a single donation, the Challenger Club, a one-time gift of $500 or more, Dollar a Day Club. There's two options for that, and the Perpetual Light Club, which is gifts billed monthly to a credit card or a bank account. So 515-223-1150, matching funds by Patricia Anderson, up to $500. Let's get the phone lines ringing. Bud, real quick, who's going to join us at let me rephrase that. Who's our guest today? How's that?
So our guest this morning is Father Carter Griffin, and I'm glad we didn't invite Adam Story to co-host today, because Story, as a Marine, might start dissing the United States Navy.
Oh, okay.
Father Griffin was a former line officer in the Navy, but he's since become a priest in the Archdiocese of Washington, D.C., and since 2011, he's been helping with the formation of priests at John Paul II Seminary. But his most recent book is Why Celibacy? Reclaiming the Fatherhood of the Priest. And I feel, Bo, this is one of the episodes that time-wise turned out well, because I know with this upcoming synod that they say there's going to be discussions around this idea of celibacy. So Father Griffin's going to dive deep into that topic.
Timely radio when we get back from these messages. This is The Uncommon Good. We'll be back right after this. The Uncommon Good is back on the air this Wednesday. Thank you for joining us. Bo Bonner, Dr. Budmar, thank you for joining us on this Carathon Week. And as we get into our interviews, remember the whole time, it's easy to do. Just call 515-223-1150, matching funds up to $500 with Patricia Anderson. So please enjoy the show, but also, if you're so moved, go ahead and call 515-223-1150 or donate at iowacatholicradio.com/donate. But if you don't mind, could you introduce our guest for today?
Yes, this morning we have the privilege of having on the show Father Carter Griffin. He's a priest of the Archdiocese of Washington, and since 2011 he's been engaged in the formation of seminarians at St. John Paul II Seminary in Washington, D.C. He's a graduate of Princeton University and also a Navy veteran. So, Father Griffin, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, so we'll jump right in. Your most recent book is Why Celibacy? Reclaiming the Fatherhood of the Priest. And as our listeners can tell from the title, the book is about celibacy, so it dives deep into that topic. But it also treats at length the theology of the priesthood. And in reading this, one thread that I saw running throughout the book is the idea of the priest as a spiritual father. I guess to kick us off, could you unpack that for our listeners a bit? Why is this notion of the priest as a spiritual father so essential to our understanding of the priesthood?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I mean, I think the first thing is that what is fatherhood? I mean, the source of all things is in God the Father, right? So fatherhood is the source of life, really. It's the source of life in the world. And men and women share in that in different ways, in human fatherhood, human motherhood. It's one of the most beautiful gifts that God has given us. When he made Adam and Eve, he told them to be fruitful and multiply, and that continues to be the case today. And they procreate, which is to say that they share in God's creation in generating new human beings with immortal souls. And so we can see the beauty of fatherhood and motherhood. And I believe every man and every woman is called to either fatherhood or motherhood with their lives. Many most will probably be involved in being a fatherhood at the natural level, but even fathers who generate children are also called to be fathers not just of their bodies but of their souls. Right? They're called to give of themselves and to help their children go to heaven, to pray for them, to sacrifice for them, to bring them to the sacraments and teaching about God and that spiritual fatherhood that every man is called to with his own children, when he has natural children, a priest does that with his whole life, And so to sort of see this, first of all, this common bond that priests have with other natural fathers who are also spiritual fathers, to see that common bond, but also to see the beauty of the priestly vocation, which is ordered to giving life in the order of grace. I think it's a very compelling, very beautiful way of seeing the priesthood. And I would also say, by the way, that that Christ, who was a man, a true man, was also a father, and to sort of see how he gave life, he gave natural life in all kinds of ways, he even brought people to life who were dead and all kinds of different things, but certainly, and first and foremost, he gave spiritual life. He poured himself out ultimately on the cross, and he gave life to the whole church, and in that he became a father, and so priests who are ordained to stand in the place of Christ are also ordained to stand in the place of Christ, who is head and also father. And so I think there are a lot of different ways of sort of angles on it. I think it's very deep, very beautiful, but also kind of very, in a way, very simple. It's a way of seeing priesthood as a way of giving life.
Bo and I, sometimes before a radio show, will joke that we've got our gotcha questions and the kitty ready to go for our interviewee, and that's not how we roll. But this is a topic where, when you get into priesthood and celibacy, it is a place where the church today is very countercultural and where the Catholic Church stands out from a lot of cultural assumptions. And even with what you were just talking about, Father Griffin, this idea of fatherhood, I've had conversations with students who say, I had a terrible father, and just like the idea of God as father, that's not really a concept that, approaching God as father is not something that's consoling for me. Or in the broader culture, I think you have attacks against family and fatherhood more generally. I guess to play devil's advocate, should this usage be abandoned? Is there some other way of understanding the priesthood, or what's kind of like the virtues that we're retaining by continuing to say, no, a priest is spiritual father, and this is really significant?
Yeah. Well, I think that it's a really important and really kind of insightful point that many people, perhaps now more than other times, maybe not, I don't know, that we've always had good and not so good fathers out there, but many people are struggling, certainly, to see the beauty of this term father, whether it's applied to God or to a priest or to just a man, who's a father. That fatherhood doesn't ring positively in the ears of many. And I think the answer to that is a couple things. First of all, when we have a bad experience of something, that doesn't, if we subjectively have a bad experience, it's a subjective thing. It doesn't necessarily mean the thing itself is bad. People can have a bad experience of all kinds of things that are in themselves good. And I think the answer needs to be helping people to kind of maybe purify some of those memories so they can see the beauty that they were not given, that was deprived of them, that was deprived to them, and so that they can that they're able to kind of penetrate through their own subjective experience and see the kind of the deeper and more beautiful reality underneath. If somebody has a bad experience of a teacher, in school, and we still want to be able to see that subject for something that is good and teaching as something that is good. So I'd say that that's one aspect. I think another thing to look at is to say that, Jesus himself reveals God as Father. It's in some ways the most revolutionary and maybe in some ways the most important thing that he taught when he came, And so that's kind of part of the deposit of faith. It's part of the revelation that God is Father. And rather than discarding that terminology, which is the source of the terminology for talking about human fatherhood, including that of priest, so we can't discard one without discarding the other. So I think it's kind of both of those together, try to purify and give good examples, give ourselves to become good examples of. It's a call to holiness, really, for us to become better examples of fathers and therefore lead people more clearly to the fatherhood of God.
Father Griffin, this is Bo Bonner. Thank you for coming on the show today. I think about what Bud was talking about, the impasse that a lot of us notice in fatherhood talk, not only with the priesthood, but in this sort of general way. I wonder if sometimes it's because in modernity, and I'm using that more to mean just in contemporary times, when we begin to talk about fathers and mothers and families, we're very prone to think about them in the post-Leave It to Beaver nuclear family sort of way. And so when we talk about fathers and mothers and children, we have like a nuclear family in mind, but particularly when we talk about the relationships of father, mother, children, the dynamic is almost always individual and like my relationship with my dad. And then fatherhood becomes sort of this singular thing that an individual sort of chooses to do. It's even become sort of a consumerist thing where there's like dad Twitter and dad wear, and it gets even weirder when you start talking to millennials about the way they use the word dad and father, etc. I wonder if what part of this does, why we have difficulty conceiving of a priest as father, is we don't think of fatherhood communally enough. So if we think about that in Catholic social teaching, we say the most basic unit of society is the family, and we don't mean that, though, and certainly not at that time, like the nuclear family, like a mom, a dad, and their 1.5 kid. We mean like families, right? These large groups that have patriarchs and matriarchs and multiple generations living together, and certainly cousins and second cousins who know each other. Do you suppose that might be part of our difficulty of conceiving what we mean when we say father, and maybe why some of the negative connotations with maybe power or abuse seem to pop up more and more is because we have a paucity in our understanding of fatherhood?
I think so, Bo. I think that's part of it, and I think that it kind of there's a dynamic that works in both directions. As human fathers have failed so often, in living up to the dignity of our vocation, that it's caused this sort of this unmooring of people from that connection to their own dads, and also to maybe more communal nature. You have the whole phenomenon of the doofus dad, on almost every TV show and movie that was coming out for a while there. Now, I think there's a little bit of a reaction to that, as I think people are starting to recognize that, the importance of fathers. I think that there is actually a reaction going on to some extent, and I think there's a renewal among a lot of younger people of the beauty of good fatherhood. But I think it also works the dynamic works in the other direction, in the sense that as we focus so much on power and kind of dismantling patriarchy and sort of looking for, in a sense, the worst, and highlighting the worst constantly, and never looking at the best examples of fathers in our own lives or in history, it's also kind of discouraged and demoralized a lot of men who have therefore kind of just sort of thrown up their hands and kind of given up, And so I think we're not calling men to a kind of even a human greatness, let alone a spiritual greatness in this area of fatherhood. So I think there's sort of, in a sense, plenty of blame to go around. But I think you're right. The upshot, it remains the same, that there is a very kind of a narrow understanding of fatherhood, and not the communal. I would add to that, by the way, and say it's not just a question for the extended family and all that, but even sort of the understanding of fatherhood and motherhood in our culture and at large. Our ancient, communities would sometimes call any old person, father or mother, and that understanding that fatherhood and motherhood can be in all kinds of different places in life, among teachers and coaches and mentors and all these things, that to receive life from others should be an ordinary thing for a young person to receive from an older person, and across the board. And I think if you would have a much richer kind of context in which to place the word father, or mother for that sake, if we had that more communal understanding of it.
So, Father Griffin, to kind of pivot to the heart of the book, the title is Why Celibacy? And I kind of worry, so again, when I think about these theological topics, a lot of times my mind goes to conversations that I've had with students. And one thing that pops up is, for some, even within the church, when they think about the discipline of celibacy, they think about it in terms of, I compare it to the way that some people talk about not eating meat on Fridays. It's almost like something that the Catholic Church does that's supra-rational. And what I mean by that is, it seems like this willy-nilly rule, and we do it, but a lot of people don't understand why. But as with penance on Fridays, with the discipline of celibacy, one thing that your book shows is there's this deep theological background to the whole discipline. So it's not an arbitrary rule, but there's a whole theology that's really connected to what we've been talking about during the first part of the show. Could you unpack some of that for our listeners? Like why celibacy? What's the theological rationale behind why the Church has asked so many priests to embrace this?
Yeah, and I think a good place to start would be when our Lord speaks about celibacy. Now, granted, he's not talking about priestly celibacy in particular, but he talks about it as being those who make themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of God. That is to say, you're not just a eunuch. You're not just giving up marriage for the sake of the sacrifice alone, as if that is the purpose of it. But rather, it's for the sake of a greater good. It's for the sake, and I would put that in the context of fatherhood. It's for the sake of giving life. That is to say, the primary focus of celibacy is not on not getting married. but on loving in a different way, and in a way that it can be very powerful and give a lot of life and pour out a lot of life into the world. And it sort of dilates a man's heart. It kind of widens our horizon in a way that we're able to receive people coming to us, even in a very practical sense, just to receive whoever comes to us without, kind of making distinctions. And that can be a source of great life in the world. I think the reason, perhaps, why we might say Christ himself was celibate was not because he was somehow unable physically to be a husband or emotionally to be a husband. He would have been the best of all husbands, and fathers. But his heart was for all men, and all women. And so that celibacy was clearly ordered to his own supernatural fatherhood. And I think the same is true of St. Paul and of John the Baptist and of some of the great prophets in the past and so many saints through the history of the church. That's the reason, that the rationale is for the sake of love. And I think that that's kind of the elevator conversation about celibacy, is that it's not just like giving up meat on Friday, but it's a way of like helping a man love in a unique and very powerful way.
Father, what this reminds me of is when I was converting, I remember someone making a big deal that like many parts of the liturgy probably had some practical reasoning behind them, at least at first. So I have a distinct memory of someone who was they were teaching me RCIA. Let's not criticize where this was at. This was a bad move, but just to get to the point. They were like, well, the altar rail and the altar gate, that was just because back in the past, people didn't always give money when they were giving their gifts. So they'd give, chickens or live animals to the priests. And so they had to have the altar rail and everything so that the animals wouldn't get in the back. And that's only the reason we have it. And, you can see where they're going, this sort of demystifying language. And then they go, it was only subsequent that people came up with this sort of theology of the altar rail and the idea of the Holy of Holies and how it matched up, blah, blah, blah. And the thing that I thought was hilarious about this was someone coming into the church is I was just amazed at the brilliance of Catholics to go, okay, sure, there's this very mundane reason, let's make sure chickens don't get back by the altar, but the altar rail also stands for so much more theologically. So I hear people say similar things about celibacy. And they might have a little bit of a point, right? There's a lot, as most people know, in the Eastern Church, there are married priests. So it's not uniform throughout all of Christian history. And, I mean, your book admits that. Everybody knows this. What starts to be interesting is there's people who try to make this line of argument go, oh, well, the reason that the West embraced celibacy is because they were worried about things like inheritance. What do you do when a priest has 5 sons? You can't divide up the church. How do you pay them? Blah, 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 blah. But I think they precisely miss exactly this way in which Catholicism has always been more than willing to talk about how the practical and the spiritual feed off of each other, and like you've said earlier in the show, that the influence goes both ways. So there might be something to say. I think it's a good enough point as someone who grew up Protestant and saw many preachers' kids have a difficult life following their fathers around. There is something to say, like, you don't have to worry about inheritance or taking care of a family, the sort of practical availability that you're talking about. But certainly then the spiritual stems from that as well. Like, if Jesus Christ is, the one completely for others who poured himself out, kenosis, Philippians 2, why wouldn't you want that shown in a physical way and in a practical way? I don't know. I guess the question I have to you is, when you present a book like this, do you get people trying to marshal what they think is these sort of practical historical arguments? And do you see them failing for similar reasons, that they seem to forget that we believe in an incarnational faith after all?
Yeah, I grew up Protestant as well, and I would say that it was not just the like the kids, the preachers' kids who were having struggles, or the preachers who were maybe getting divorced, things like that. I mean, those were all very real concerns. But it was also just that when I went to the pastor, I always knew that I wasn't first in his book. I couldn't be. He had a wife and kids. Obviously they came first. They should have come first. And I think that I see that contrast as perhaps you do so clearly when you go to a priest, he's not married, and like you're his first. You're the first one in his book. And you're the only one that matters in that moment that he's talking to you. So I think there's those very natural aspects that I think are really important to bring out and say, yeah, there's some truth to that. But I think it's a very far cry to say that, therefore, that's the reason why the Church in the 12th century invented celibacy, which is just a factual, it's just incorrect. I mean, that celibacy goes back as far as we can possibly determine. There are synods in the 3rd century or early 300s in Spain which already take celibacy as for granted. And those are, and so it presumes it's already ancient in the early 300s. And so the idea that this stuff just was invented by canonists in the 12th century in order to protect church property or something like that, you can say, like, come on. I mean, fine, there's some truth to that, but I mean, it goes a lot deeper, and it's a lot more beautiful than that. And that's not a later reinterpretation. I mean, Jesus himself wasn't saying to a eunuch, for the sake of the kingdom of God, not losing its inheritance. It was for the sake of the kingdom of God, and for the people of God. And that's why he himself was celibate, who is the only priest, which is one point that I make when people talk about optional celibacy, that say, well, I mean, first of all, just keep in mind, there is only one priest of the new covenant, and it's Jesus Christ, and he's a celibate, and so to say that you're going to make this somehow optional as if this is a discipline that's easily discarded like fish on Friday, is not really, it doesn't really grasp the depth of and the importance of the thing. I have other issues with optional celibacy, which you may want to get into, but I think you're right. I think pointing out the natural, but then kind of drawing out some of the spiritual repercussions, which are far deeper.
Also, I think we can throw down that, like, getting rid of fish on Friday has had its own extreme problems that we're all still dealing with. But that's a whole other show. So we're coming.
Hey, if I could insert. I was not calling for the abolition of penance on Friday. I think the way I framed that question was I was talking about the way that people understand or think about the discipline.
Whatever, bud. We know you're in the pocket of big vegetarian burgers.
That's right.
All right, so we got to go to break. We'll be back with Father Griffin after this. Back with the Uncommon Good, Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Morrow joining you on this beautiful Wednesday. We're in the middle of our fall carathon, so if you're thinking about it, it's easy to donate, 515-223-1150, 515-223-1150, or iowacatholicradio.com/donate. We have matching funds, $500 for Patricia Anderson. And so while you're listening to our interview, if you feel so moved, please go ahead and give us a call or head over to the donate button. We have with us on air Father Carter Griffin. His new book, Why Celibacy? Reclaiming the Fatherhood of the Priest, is what we're talking about today. It's been a wonderful conversation so far, and we're looking forward to the rest of it. Father Griffin, thank you for joining us back on the show.
Thanks so much. You're very welcome.
So, like we're wont to do at the end of the first segment, we started really kind of bringing up the big guns and huge history and things like this, and then very rudely asked you to sort of sum things up in 2 minutes, Father. But as far as the sweep of your book, and maybe not only dealing, like you said, with technical questions, theological ones, but historical ones, what could people expect, or what? Maybe this is another way to put it. What are questions people usually have for you that you made a special effort to answer in the book?
Well, I think a big one would be how celibacy actually contributes to fatherhood. Well, and maybe before that, how we'd already talked about it, how a priest is a father. But second of all, how does celibacy contribute to that? And third of all, if that's the case, well, and yet we have struggles in the priesthood and things like that, and a lack of shortage. Why not make it at least optional? So I think those would be some of the main things. I think there is also a kind of a sneaking suspicion among many, even faithful Catholics, that somehow celibacy is the cause of the sexual abuse crisis, both in the lack of chastity and lack of fidelity, but also in the lack of action on the part of bishops, the cover up and so forth. So I try to address those things as well. So those are kind of some of the big picture thing. And then I think maybe a last one would be, sort of kind of like a so what, like how does this actually help the church? How does this help married people? How does this, how is celibacy one of the gifts that Jesus has given to his church?
So, Father, that piqued my interest with discussions around the sex abuse crisis and commentators sometimes bringing up celibacy in relation to all that. What are some of the things you say in response to questions about how that figured into the crisis, if at all?
Yeah. Well, I think there are a couple things there. I think an important thing to keep in mind is that almost every culture in history has had unmarried people. Our own culture has unmarried people, and in the past, and frankly, for most people in the present, we recognize that not being married that doesn't necessarily mean you're living an unfulfilled or unsatisfied or immature life, or a life in which you're a danger to other people or anything like that. That it can be a very respected thing for somebody to forego marriage in order to take care of an aging parent, or in order to take care of, to become a nurse and then to spend your entire life taking care of the sick, or whatever it might be. And to recognize that it's really the post-sexual revolutionary culture in which we have this deep suspicion of somebody who doesn't engage in sexual relations as somebody who may be a kind of danger to others, because we have this sort of, you're kind of a bundle of sexual repressed energy waiting to explode at any moment, or whatever it might be, which is just something that has zero scientific truth or merit to it, And as I say, there are many people who are not married and live perfectly healthy and fulfilled lives, including, by the way, the vast majority of priests. And so I think that's kind of an important reminder for people that, that they may have kind of drunk the Kool-Aid a little bit in this idea that sex is kind of a human need, and without it, somebody lives a stunted and immature life. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind, is that we're looking at this through a kind of maybe a little bit of a warped vision of the culture today. I think as well, just kind of recognizing that the problem here is not celibacy, but infidelity. And we see certainly plenty of infidelity in marriage too, I'm sad to say, and just having priests go off and get married, it's not as if you're going to not have infidelity anymore, I'll often say that, that celibacy causes sex abuse the way that marriage causes adultery, which is to say, you could get rid of adultery by getting rid of marriage, but at what cost, and that's not really the point. The idea is to live faithfully and to hold priests to that accountability, and to punish priests who are not faithful, and to get rid of priests who are a danger to people, and to take seriously your responsibility as a bishop to take care of your people, and not to push things under the carpet. All these things are what are part of fidelity, and that's what we should be expecting from our priests and from our bishops and from our married people and from our single people. And so I think that's kind of the right context in which to address this. And I think, incidentally, that statistically, there's a lot of support for that, in the sense that the vast majority of priests obviously are not abusers, and the vast majority of priests are living very fulfilled, joyful lives, and, in percentages way above the norm among lay people, And so it's kind of giving a sort of a widening the vision, a little bit, I think, to see the answer to that.
No, that's all really important stuff. And I guess to draw some of this back to the theme of our show is Catholic social teaching and the common good. And one thing I love about your book is that it gets into the gifts that celibacy provides to the community. And when I was reading that section, it really drew my mind back to, I had a mentor at St. Louis University, Grant Kaplan, and he wrote an article for First Things called Celibacy as Political Resistance. And in that article, he's really drawing on the work of Johann Adam Moeller. And he says Moeller makes this big point that celibacy focuses on the heavenly city, so that the practice of celibacy indicates an eschatological hope for life in the next world. And in Dr. Kaplan's analysis, he sees this as one way that the Church resists the state overreaching its own influence. So he kind of connects this idea to papal primacy, where the Catholic Church has these ways where it's constantly reminding its members, like, yes, you're in the world but not of the world, and your citizenship is ultimately in heaven. I think I've found, sorry to be a little long-winded here, but I found confirmation in this in actually Solzhenitsyn's work on, I think it's in the Gulag Archipelago, but he says under the communist persecution, sometimes those who were first to cave, when you think about clerics, were married priests, and he said their concern was for the well-being of their family. And Solzhenitsyn in that book is not going out of his way to criticize married priests. He's like Moeller. He's emphasizing the kind of freedom and the gifts that like a celibate priesthood does provide. Would you have more to say on those points, or like does that sound plausible to you? How how does this reverberate out to the church community and even like the common good? What this provides for our social life?
Yeah, no, I think it's a fascinating point, and I truly do believe that. I mean, to start with the family, right? I mean, there's one of the reasons why there has been consistently since the sexual revolution and so many policies aimed seemingly at weakening the family is because the family is the ultimate the ultimate subversive element against a sprawling, kind of growing state apparatus, right? I mean, if the family is strong, you simply are not going to be able to have the kind of tyranny that you might have otherwise. So I think there's a very interesting political kind of implications of some of this. And honestly, I believe celibacy is similar, right? There's something about a celibate man that when it's directed towards kind of the kingdom of God and not the kingdom of Caesar, there is something about him that is extremely dangerous, to any would-be tyrants. And so I think both the family and celibacy are, I often wonder, like, why are people so interested in whether I have a wife or not? People who are not Catholic, people who could care less about me or about my priesthood or about my religion, want me to be, but why is that? And I would encourage your listeners to really think about that for a second. Why are they so interested in our celibacy? And I think the answer is, number one, because I'm a walking contradiction to the fundamental dogma of the sexual revolution, namely that any restraint on sex is wrong, right? I'm just by walking around, I'm a threat to that basic dogma of their faith, right? And the second thing is that there is something about a celibate man that is kind of unhinged, right, from an earthly point of view, right? You can't stamp him down. And so, when Colby steps out and he says, "Who are you?" and he says, "I am a Catholic priest," right? And he gives his life for that married man. There is something that is radically sort of unsettling about that, I think, and really beautiful. And I think that's part of why celibacy, and I think your reference to the Moeller article is very apropos.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest, I'm always like, when I think about the priesthood and me, I go, yeah, they're going to get killed first. Right? And they have to be happy about that. Yeah, right? I mean, like, you're all going to get martyred first and give us a running chance to get our families and get out of the way. That's the deal, right? No, I mean, I'm only being a little flippant. I think that there's something to this, right? That you look back in the history, and it's precisely this idea that there is something that not having a family, the good that a family may be, allows for people who are celibate to truly not only have the sort of white martyrdom of dying to themselves every day for people and the sort of operative things they do on the ground, but should the time come, they don't need to fear martyrdom. They don't leave anyone behind, and there's a way in which the spiritual ministry that they're convening on earth can be even more powerful in heaven. And I think you even see this, going back to the whole practical laws. This is why forever there were laws on the books that the one group of people that couldn't own weapons and couldn't defend themselves were clerics. And the idea, right, was as a human, we all have, the right of self-defense, but in a way, the clerics have already signed on to be dead in Christ and alive in Him too. And I think that you start to see that with something like, I'm going back to like arguments I hear people say. They're like, well, what about when Jesus says, "Call no man father"? Isn't this sort of like a radically important aspect to the early church? But I'm a Benedictine Oblate, and you immediately start to think about how much Saint Benedict really leans on the idea about an abbot as a father, because he's in the person of Jesus Christ and for God the Father for his monks. But what you really start to understand is Saint Benedict doesn't think this means that there won't be abuses of power. He goes on and on about how abbots and priors can mess everything up, and the sort of like huge weight that they carry before themselves, like on their shoulders at the final judgment. St. Benedict says they'll have to give an account not only for their own lives, but for every single monk that's been under their care. And I really start to see the Western Church take this on for the priesthood itself, to say, no priest gives an account just of himself, but of his flock. I think it's hard for people, like I said, to imagine that we can understand fatherhood for more than just the guy who, like you said, tells dad jokes and barbecues hamburgers on Labor Day. But that's the sort of what we're up against, is the sort of the martyrdom of choosing to be a father, like you said, even biologically. There's a real way in which if you're going to be a decent dad at all, you have to die to yourself. So, of course, why wouldn't we want to see that emblematically, so to speak, at the head of the congregations of our parishes every Sunday? But I guess the last thing would be, and this is, I think, what you get at in your book, if there's a misgivings or misunderstandings, that squarely falls on all of us in the church. We haven't done our job, both like people teaching their children, and then there's, of course, priests that haven't done their job. And so that all of this talk is not just a sort of apology or a defense, but a great call to say we have a lot of work to do to not rehabilitate, but to let people reimagine what fatherhood means.
Yeah, and when you talk about that text, for example, from the scriptures, call no man on earth your father, for you have one Father who is in heaven, I think that actually works the other way around, because what he's really saying is all fatherhood has to be grounded in God's father. I mean, Jesus himself uses the term father, He talks about what father would give his son, scorpion, all that stuff. I mean, Paul talks about himself as a spiritual father in Christ. So fatherhood is all there. Clearly, he wasn't saying you're not allowed to use the word father. What he's saying is that it all has to be grounded in God. And when we lose that, then we lose everything, and then it does become patriarchy. Then it just becomes another exercise of power. If we're not receiving our authority and receiving the love that we can give to our children from God himself. I had an old spiritual director who used to say that celibacy is the backbone of Catholic marriage. And I always kind of got that intuitively, but it wasn't until I really wrote this book where I kind of thought about it so deeply, that really that's kind of see the connection between the two. And that celibacy is such an important thing out there to remember that all love has to be directed back at God, including the highest of all human loves, namely marriage. And that ultimately we are all called, to live lives of sanctity, and including those who are married and those who are not married. And so I think seeing this kind of the commonality between the baptism, that we all share, and then the holy orders, which leads to a new kind of fatherhood, and the celibacy, which helps protect that, is, I think, a very rich way of looking at the church. And it could be really helpful for people who otherwise look at celibacy as just kind of a strange kind of relic from the past.
This is a joke. I'm giving a shout out to my brother, who I think came up with like one of the best skit ideas about the Bible on earth to make a point. I promise there's a point. But if you imagine like Jesus is there and there's a crowd and he says that line, which father among you would give your child a snake? And my brother imagines that someone immediately jumps and says, I will, Jesus. And Jesus is like, no. And then like the whole crowd's like, I will too. And they really misunderstand the point. And I think this call no man father happens to be one of those where no one reads really before or after. They just hear the call no man father, and then someone jumps up and goes like, okay, I never will. What should we call them instead? And, when we, this is why we have things like tradition to make us understand in a more broad way. That's all I got, but I really wanted to give my brother airtime. I'm sure you have a much more erudite question to ask.
No, that sounds very Monty Python-esque, but I love the point that both of you are kind of hinting at that, even I think sometimes as those of us who are married, we think like, the priests have the discipline of celibacy, so they're oriented towards the eschaton, and then like I'm involved in this romantic relationship. But the passages that we've been kind of dancing around, those say to all followers of Jesus, like, look, your priority is the kingdom of God. So there's a way that marriage can be treated just as idolatrously. It's not like, well, now I'm married, so these eschatological commitments don't bear upon me. Like, we have to be okay to saying, like, it's more important to me that my children embrace all that God has for them, and that might be celibacy, and not, providing me with grandchildren or whatever it happens to be. So this is all great. And saying that, Father, I guess we're running up against the end of the show, but my mind is going to, I know you're closely involved with the formation of priests, and the lay faithful, like, when I hear the news these days, one of my prayers is, like, God give us holy priests. And I guess in your work with younger men who are first entering the priesthood, do you see positive momentum around the kind of, like, positive ideas that we've been talking about in relation to spiritual fatherhood that's generative, that brings life, and celibacy, and what that commitment can provide?
Yeah, I think I see a lot of. I see a lot of positive signs. I did an article this past summer with Monsignor Andy Baker from Mount St. Mary's. We just talked about so many of the changes that have happened in seminary formation in the last 20 or 30 years that a lot of people just don't know about. They assume that when they read about the scandals that people are being trained in exactly the same way, and it's just not the case. And I would also say, in addition to that, the quality of the men entering in, I find to be edifying year after year. They have a lot of struggles. They're coming from an environment that can be very difficult to grow in discipleship, but they're coming in with open hearts and open minds and a real generosity. It's not an easy vocation, so they're They're generally choosing it sort of against the headwinds of the culture at large, and sometimes of their own families. And they're coming in, therefore, not for social status or esteem or respect. They're coming in because they believe the Lord Jesus is calling them. And I think there's a real openness and docility to good formation. Not every seminary is forming as we'd all like them to be, but I think many more are today than not that long ago. And so I think there's a lot of reasons for hope looking down the road.
Well, Father, like I said, we're getting to the end of our show, and we've been so appreciative. It's been a wonderful conversation, but I want to give you a little bit of time, not only to talk about the book, but if there's other ways people can go find your work, and maybe if they want to contribute to the well-being of things like the formation of celibacy in seminaries. Is there places they can go to find out more about your work, or prayers, or anything like that? If you want to do that in the last few minutes.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, no, I don't have a lot of sort of work out there. I have some articles and things like that. Obviously, this book. The most important, when I go and visit parishes, and often I'll go with the seminarians, I tell them, a missionary has to come around and ask for money because you need money to run a mission. I said, we've got the money, because we're run by the Archdiocese of Washington, but we do need the prayers. And I'm convinced that it's that the fruitfulness of the vocations program here in this diocese and other dioceses is because of the prayers and sacrifices of so many people. And it's not just the prayer on the Sunday morning Mass, as important as that might be, but that personal, insisting prayer, pray that the Lord of the harvest may send out laborers for his harvest. We look around and we see, some of the struggles in the church, and we see that, that we don't have the priest that we'd like to have, or that we should have, that we deserve to have. Well, have we prayed? Have we sacrificed? Have we given up, a meal once a week or once a month, for the sake of a holy priest? And right, until we've done that, then none of us really have a right to complain, right? And so we're all kind of in this mix together, and forming an environment where children are really asking God, what their vocation is. And I'm not just saying vocation in the sense of priest and religious life. Whatever their vocation is. Is it an environment? Am I raising my children? Am I helping my children raise their grandchildren, my grandchildren in such a way that the most important question they have to answer is not what college they're going to go to, but what their calling is. And I think until we're doing those things, we're not really doing enough. And I think as people do those more and more, we're going to see the kind of the whole thing turn around, because the culture is certainly not going to be converting anytime soon, as far as I can tell. Anything can happen, I suppose. But the church internally will be far readier for whatever comes down the road, the stronger we get, and the more support, spiritual support especially, we're getting to priests, religious, and married couples, and people raising young children. And if we do that, then I think the future can be extremely bright.
Father Carter Griffin, author of the book Why Celibacy? Reclaiming the Fatherhood of the Priest. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Father.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks.
May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, in our families, in our city, our state, nation, the entire world, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is The Uncommon Good, and we'll be back next week.
The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr is heard every week on wonderful Catholic stations like this one, and anytime on podcast. Just search for The Uncommon Good.